Hi everyone, and welcome to those of you that are online and joining us. On behalf of the Australia-New Zealand chapter of ACEDS, the Association of Certified E-Discovery Specialists, and also Relativity, one of our highly valued sponsors of the chapter, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone online who's joining us from across Australia, New Zealand, and other places around the globe. I'm John Wallace. I'm a member of the board of the Australia-New Zealand chapter, and also work on a part-time consultancy basis with Relativity. I'm really thrilled to be moderating this webinar today, and we're very fortunate to have a stellar panel with us. Firstly, we have Avram Lum, who's the founder and head of Watt & Kearney's e-discovery and cyber forensics practice, where he leads the firm's legal tech solutions for complex data breaches, digital investigations, and litigation support. With over 16 years of experience across the APAC region, Avram brings a unique perspective, having worked across law firms, e-discovery service providers, and Big Four consultancies. Next, we have John Karamoschis, a seasoned e-discovery professional with over 15 years experience across both service providers and software companies. His diverse background enables him to bring a well-rounded perspective and a practical, solutions-oriented approach to every project. John's known for his ability to navigate complex challenges across the e-discovery cycle, helping clients achieve defensible, efficient outcomes. And Ralph Behrens is the Manager of Sales Engineering for APAC at Relativity, where he leads the technical strategy and supports client engagement across the region. With over 20 years experience and a strong background in legal tech, cloud security, and data privacy, Ralph's known for helping organisations translate complex technical challenges into practical, scalable solutions. Based in Sydney, he works closely with law firms, government agencies, and corporate clients to deliver impactful outcomes. Just before we get into the Q&A, I'm going to just share a little bit of information about ACEDS for those joining on today. May not know a lot about ACEDS, but I'll just give a very quick overview. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so this is our session today. ACEDS, the vision statement is here. So really it's about, it's a global organisation. It's really about inspiring and educating and supporting the development of those of us working in e-discovery technology right across the globe. Whoops, there's a bit of a delay here. This is our current board members, office holders, which are all there for you to see. I'm sure any of them would be happy if you wanted to reach out to them at any stage and ask them more about ACEDS or even having a role in ACEDS. The chapter goals for the Australia-New Zealand chapter, it's a relatively new chapter, but it really is about developing and facilitating education, learning, knowledge sharing, etc., right across the region. It is tech agnostic and about supporting and creating an educational content that is really going to help individuals grow personally and professionally. As I mentioned, Relativity is one of the 7 valued sponsors. There's the rest of them there. If any of you are online and you're working for any of those organisations, then you've probably got a really good head start at getting involved. As a chapter, we work very closely with each of these sponsors, running events like this. There's e-discovery day later in the year, and a whole lot of other things that we're really keen to do and partnering with these sponsors throughout the course of the year. So as I said, they're all highly valued, and really without their ongoing support, it would make it very difficult for the chapter to continue to exist and grow. And just cutting to the chase, if you'd like to get involved, there's some opportunities there. You can scan the barcode, you can follow our LinkedIn pages. As I said, you could talk to any of the current chapter members, the board office holders. We also have a network of directors at large. We have about 6 directors at large across Australia and New Zealand who are all on the website. I'm sure you could reach out to any of those as well. As I said, we've got eDiscovery Day coming up later in the year, but following any of our events, joining these events, and thinking about getting involved to the point of being a member, etc., is you can really take it as far as you want to go. But like I said, it's a great network. It's a growing chapter across the region, and we're really proud of us that are on the board to be part of it and to be involved in it. I'll just stop sharing that. Okay, getting back to what we're here for today. And just before I get into the Q&A, for our audience that are online here today, we've allowed some time later in the session to take any questions and comments that you'd like to put to our panel. So please add them to the chat as we go. So on to this topic, managing and mitigating data breach incidents. I think this must be one of, if not the number one insomnia issue, as I call it, for the C-suite and other senior leadership across the organisations of all type. I'm sure it's been giving Qantas CEO Vanessa Hudson and board chair John Mullins some sleepless nights of late. For corporates, public sector and private sector, winning back the trust and confidence of your customers, the communities that you serve, even your own employees, given the personal data that our organisations hold about us, can really be a long road back. Governments and regulators are also imposing more robust frameworks and legislative requirements to help safeguard organisations and the data that they hold. So turning to our panel, when I hear risk and cyber specialists talking about this topic, I often hear this recurring theme around the most significant risks stemming from the human factors. Not necessarily technology failures, but the human factors that are involved. And I think this goes to highlighting the importance of fostering a strong culture of cybersecurity through continuous education, effective governance, etc. So I'll use that as a segue to ask each of you, how would you characterise what today's data risk landscape looks like? So you may want to touch on any emerging trends, including those that are particularly worrying. So maybe I'll throw to John to kick us off on this one.
Thanks, John. Look, overall, I'd say we're seeing good signs in a lot of organizations becoming more cyber aware, so embedding their awareness into their culture, into their training. We're seeing a good shift from having a policy document on how we respond to things, but to more of a let's plan, let's see what we will be doing. Some concerns around the feeling of playing catch up at times. You touched on insider threat as well. It's not always a malicious action. A lot of the times, some of the biggest breaches can be, triggered by something totally innocent. Some challenges, and again, I'm probably going back a few years now, but post-COVID, we've shifted to cloud and remote work. So there's that's created some challenges around, where we store data and how we access it. I guess we've also had the rise of AI-driven threats, which is starting to become more and more of a concern. And one thing that we're discussing as well, with quantum computing around the corner, what will we see there? One other thing to touch on as well, again, we've had more rules around reporting and also the Privacy Act reforms. There's additional legislation around how we use, how we report, how we store data as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Rolf, from your perspective, how are you seeing this kind of broader landscape shaping and evolving?
Certainly with Gen AI, they're becoming smarter, the methods of phishing. So we have, you have a barrage now of even more possibilities of being infiltrated. And it's really the weakest link, as you mentioned earlier, is that human component internally in your organization. So it's vital that organizations foster that knowledge and awareness of what's going on. I know that with Relativity, we have random phishing attempts that, fake emails that come out that are simulated to look like phishing emails, and we report it. And you sort of, if you fail, you go to training again and learn how to identify those threats and that. So I just had one before this meeting. I was like, not clicking on that button, but it's that regular training, essentially. It's that regular testing of your skills and keeping you on your toes, really. So that's certainly what we're seeing, and a lot of the frequency of those threats. You made mention of the Qantas one. That was from a human probably clicking a link in a data center, a call center. So
yeah, it's incredible, isn't it, what the far-reaching implications can be at that level, but also even just in our own lives. We see, you mentioned some of those emails and the phishing emails. I mean, they're getting more and more sophisticated now, and from what they used to be years ago, they were kind of fairly fairly ordinary in terms of the way they look and feel. But now it gets really hard to pick them from being fakes. Avram?
yeah, it's also almost like that if you're sending, like, doing some personal online transactions for, I don't know, your bank. And used to be that, you'd get this email from a bank that wasn't your bank and you'd discard it automatically. But somehow they're knowing what transactions you're doing. You might be buying something and expecting a delivery off Amazon or something like that, or banking and expecting a phone call or an email from your bank. And they're picking up on that. Don't ask me how they're doing it, but it's certainly happening. I'm no expert in that, but certainly it's happening.
Sure. Avram, how are you seeing this on a landscape evolve and around trends and any of the things that you think are particularly worrying or concerning, or that we need to be watching out for?
Yeah, so thanks, Sean. So thanks for an introduction. So at WK, we have a pretty big cyber practice. A lot of lawyers working on cyber-related matters, and for both Australia and New Zealand, it's a little bit different. In Australia, I'll just start off talking about the regulators. So in Australia, we have the OAIC, which stands for the Office of the Australian Information Commission, and there's a notifiable data breach scheme in the Privacy Act. And it's a little bit different between the two jurisdictions. In Australia, you do have 30 days to assess how harmful is the data that the threat actors got a hold of. And in New Zealand, it's called the Office of the Privacy Commission. And over there, they have 72 hours for you from breach to notify the commission that it happened. So it's a bit different. And with the way things are in cyber, things are moving very quickly. Like breaches from a few years ago are very different from breaches now. Before we had a lot of encryption, ransomware, loss of information, unauthorized access, and we're seeing a bit of a trend on what we call business email compromise, or BEC. So that's when, let's say, a threat actor gets control of the company's emails and starts working with that. And that could be quite scary when you have a threat actor having access to the emails and sending out emails on behalf of the organization. I'm sure people can only imagine what they can do with that. And what's also scary is when they do that, they start synchronizing it with their own systems, and they start getting access to all the emails. So it's quite scary, and things are changing really quickly. And I'm sure the regulators are trying to play a bit, are trying to work in staying ahead of the game, because a lot of times, just like in investigation forensics, usually something happens and then people try to figure out how to combat that. So it's a bit of something happens and you got to figure out how to combat that. So it's interesting. Things are changing very quickly.
Yeah, sure are. Yep. That's let's just take that a step further and maybe drill down into some of the points that you guys have raised. And insofar as how this is playing out at a more granular level, and maybe the organisations that you're working for or that you're dealing with, what's this, what I would call this data risk culture like? I mentioned in the preamble to this question, this significant risks that go stemming from the human factors. So generally, what are you seeing in terms of how proactive the organisations are in driving this awareness for their employees, promoting good risk-based practices, getting engagement from the C-suite and the tone from the top and messaging that down? John, how are you seeing that in terms of the organisations that deal with, and maybe the ones that are doing it really well and the ones that are probably not paying as much attention to it?
Great question, John. I'll start off with the ones that are doing it really well. So in essence, the cyber aware organizations, their culture, the information that's and even just the awareness, it comes from the top down. So it's having that process embedded into the C-suite, promoting that. We're looking at some good examples. A company might do a tabletop exercise. There's no defined time of how often they need to do it. There's annual pen testing. There's breach simulation, where everyone knows what to do, how to mobilize, who to call. Something Rolf touched on as well earlier, like just embedding that training and awareness into the culture. So it might be little things like those emails where you accidentally click on them and you get sent off to do mandatory training. Or similarly, if you complete exercises, a lot of the new training videos are quite almost like a game as well. So it's making sure that you're educating people, and it's no longer just an IT issue. Again, going back to insider threat, it can happen to anyone. It's making sure that the organizations and their employees are really enabled to be able to spot suspicious threats, in addition to just having the outside perimeter, so to speak. Bad example is the exact opposite of all of that. There's a policy in place, there's a document that no one really looks at, it doesn't get reviewed. Some of the worst breaches I've probably seen is where there's no real clear who's doing what, how are we reporting, no stakeholders with dedicated tasks or reporting lines. So yeah, I think the ones that plan and prepare are probably the good examples. Having just a one note or something that says, in the event of a breach, break glass, and here's the policy document, probably not the best. Yeah, probably they're probably the ones that will struggle a bit more when it comes to business continuity and containing the breach and getting back up and running.
Yeah, and I think those you touched on, it's not an IT issue. There's some organisations, I hear this mantra, it's everybody's responsibility, and I think that's which it is. It's in terms of that whole awareness and education piece. Avram, you touched on some of the regulatory stuff, the OIAC and some of the other requirements around that. But how are you seeing it in terms of organisations, and maybe even how this regulatory perspective and more robust frameworks that organisations are now operating in, how are you seeing that kind of play out and maybe go to changing some of the culture?
Yeah, so the two regular, the OIC in Australia and OPC New Zealand, like they have very similar pillars, right? The key things, there are 4 key things and pillars. It's all public, it's on their website and stuff. The 4th key things, when a breach happens, when you want to contain it, you want to make sure threat actors are gone, it's secure, they're gone, it's okay now. Assess what happened, how did it get in, what's affected, and then you have to figure out how harmful is the information that was compromised. So then you decide you work with your lawyers to decide, and they'll give you advice on whether to notify or not. And then at the end, it's more about reviewing the policies. What are you going to do about it? The regulators do want to know you got affected, right? We got to notify, or we may not have notified, but what are you going to do about it? That's something through the review. It's looking at the blast radius, like what's the impact of the data that was taken away, or the encryption? Like, what's the impact of that? It's really interesting because when clients or the companies that got affected, there's a bit of a dance between the client and the lawyers and the regulators, right? So the clients want to be very conservative. They probably don't want to disclose too much. They don't want to cause too much of the public looking at them, too much of a spotlight on them. But at the same time, you have to comply with the regulators and privacy acts and things like that. So there's a bit of working with that and also working with stakeholders from within the organizations, especially IT. It's not a finger pointing exercise. IT might be a bit defensive on things, but what really is beneficial in these, what John mentioned, these tabletop exercises, is getting a lot of buy-in, working out a plan, working out in scenarios and what are you going to do the next time it happens. So it's a lot of interesting work and things are changing. I think organizations are getting a lot more sophisticated in their cyber policies in trying to prevent these things from happening.
For sure, and no doubt these frameworks that are coming in and these requirements. I mean, we can now see some pretty hefty fines. It changes the whole accountability perspective. So yeah, it's and I'm sure it'll continue to get tougher and have be more accountability on organisations around all of this. Rolf, your perspective is probably a bit different as a vendor rep and a technologist. So how is some of what we've been hearing from the discussion thus far and more broadly across the organisations that you work with, how's that informing where software solution development is heading, perhaps generally across the industry, but also at Relativity?
Yeah, I would certainly say from a general perspective, there'd be more features and functionalities using the latest technologies with Gen AI to be able to detect much of the perimeter infiltration, if that's where the threat's coming from. Monitoring surveillance, monitoring emails that would be coming into the environment so that they're not going to be threatening the internal perimeter, the internal security and the individuals. But from a relativity point of view, which Abram was touching on, is that need to respond to regulators with building software to be able to quickly identify and accurately identify information that has been leaked. And so obviously there's still many steps into, okay, here is my data source. It's perhaps been infiltrated. Now let's look at that information, and within some software, you'll be able to look at that information, identify all the PI and who it belongs to, so that you can quickly and accurately respond to those or advise those customers to say, there's been a breach and this is the type of data that's being breached. You want to do that as quickly as possible.
Yep. And I'll actually come back to that after, because I'd like to just pick your brain a bit more on that in terms of just how some of what you've mentioned around technology and Gen AI, etc., is really making a difference, even though it's all, particularly Gen AI, is relatively new. But we'll come back to that. There's a point on what Avram mentioned. I want to pick up around, and Avram, I'm sure the audience would like to hear a bit more about what may be some of the key considerations and good practices in terms of this incident identification and containment, what I might call the sort of first responder actions, triaging and all that. You touched on which I thought was an interesting term, the blast radius. Do you want to just talk a bit more about that, around what are some of those, really early critical responses when there is such an incident?
Yeah, so I'll first talk about a little bit about the roles in a breach that might happen. You have a lot of different groups working together when a breach happens or post breach. The beginning usually involves, obviously those affected. The company affected will give maybe the insurer or give a law firm a call and just talk about what happened. And then an incident responder might come into play and help out. So there's an incident response, there's a lawyer. So there's a lawyer, there's a regulator, there's the company that's affected, and there's also the individuals that are affected. The IR's very important role is to manage the situation and the response. Like what are we doing? Are they out? Are they still there? Is it contained? The forensics come in and they start figuring out what actually happened. Which data was affected? Was it emails? Did they get this? Did they get this server? Is it a whole company-wide thing? Well, what actually happened? And also very important is how did they get in? So that's the DF part of it. Then there's actually the e-discovery people. So probably most people on this call right now, people like myself, whose role is more working with the lawyers to understand what's in the actual data. So that's actually it's a bit of a big collaboration effort from everyone. And it's very important for everyone to kind of know the roles. People in e-discovery are generally quite tech savvy, know a little bit about forensics. Same with digital forensic people, they know a bit about e-discovery. It's very important, I think, that traditional e-discovery is done quite differently to a breach response. And it's good to be very open-minded and really respect everyone's role and everything. The company effect is actually very important as well, because it's up to the client or the company to inform the lawyers, like what kind of data is there, right? Like, okay, they got a hold of these systems. These systems contain this kind of information. It's let's say it's a medical practice. They got into this database. This kind of database contains this kind of information, and this is sensitive because. So it's very important for the lawyers to work very closely with the clients to really understand the data and what kind of impact it is. Could be their clients, could be a school talking about children, could be pictures, a lot of sensitive information. The blast radius is understanding how harmful the data is. So when we talk about personal identifier information, it could be just like a phone number. So hypothetically, a phone number by itself, may not be that harmful. Or let's talk about a name and an email address. So John Wallace and John Wallace's email address. Okay, fine. Like how harmful is that? But however, if there is a document, that the threat actors got a hold of that has John Wallace, this is passport information, this is his TFN, this is BSB, this is account number, that really adds up and puts John Wallace as more of a high risk kind of affected individual. So it's really our lawyers working with the clients and everybody, really trying to assess how harmful the data is and working and reporting that with the regulator and coming out with advice to clients whether they do need to go through a PI review exercise to generate like a notification.
Gosh, Avram, you got me paranoid now about my license and my passport and all that kind of stuff. I'll have to go and check where it all is. But on a serious note, you also touched on something there around the skill sets of e-discovery specialists, and investigating a breach is very different to what is traditional e-discovery. For those that are online, that can see the logo up there, Legal Data Intelligence. This is a community that has been established about 12 months and is really on about pushing this whole notion of the valuable skill sets of traditional e-discovery practitioners to a whole range of other data challenges within organizations. So often we see this kind of lens and pigeonhole people, and it's not just in e-discovery, but there's a skill set that belongs to a particular discipline. But I think as we're seeing with the growing evolution of data sets, the complexity of data, the skill sets that e-discovery professionals have acquired are very, very transferable and very valuable across other data challenges. So I would encourage people to explore that. There's a great website, if you Google Legal Data Intelligence, to have a look at that. So thank you, Abram, for that nice segue and the opportunity for me to mention that. John, when we chatted about this, you talked about some of what you called the look back aspects, which I also thought was a pretty fascinating way of looking at it. You want to just share that with our audience as well?
And yeah, sure, of course. So just touching on what Avram said about, a lot of the time there are different teams with different logs, different roles, sorry. One example with the look back, or one of the key considerations, if there's a team operating on containment, the incident response team, or getting the business back up and running, the first thing we always tell them is we need those logs, don't nuke them. We that look back, whether it's for insurance purposes or whether it's to ascertain whether PI has been compromised, to touch on what Abram was saying is, again, how did they get in? What did they look at? Is there signs of exfiltration? And if so, is it likely to be PI? They're the type of questions we look to answer. And there's usually two deliverables. One will be a report of findings. For the people who have ever engaged in like a digital forensic investigation before, it's quite similar. The only main difference is it tends to look at logs and the threat actor's movements. The other output, if personal information is likely to have been compromised, is again getting a team involved to commence a PI review. Where and I think we touch on it. I can go into it in the next question as well in a bit more detail, but I might as well move into that now. So a lot of the time with the cyber forensic part, the first thing we look at, you might look at firewall logs, which will give you a suspicious IP address. It's likely to ascertain, did they get in by, brute force might be one of the methods. Once we've got the logs, we have evidence of how they entered, and then the bit about what they looked at. One of the biggest misconceptions in, I guess, incident response, for better words, or PI reviews, is that once there's been an attack, you have to process and review everything. Using forensic tools, there's ways of ascertaining exactly what a threat actor looked at. So for the people on the call that know about shell bags, that allows you to see exactly which folders someone accessed, and to add to that, if there's evidence of, let's say, an SFTP being installed in a location, if that folder contains PI, you're reporting on you're reporting on interim findings as you're undertaking this exercise. If there's evidence of PI being in those folders, you're processing that. You're mobilizing for a personal information review. You're probably also working with the crisis management team to prepare for some form of breach notification.
Yep. And you've mentioned this role of the specialist role of the cyber forensic analyst. I guess what I've observed, and you mentioned the importance of the tabletop exercises and all those kind of things in terms of that, the preventative aspects. But I guess the whole response thing really is very much a multidisciplinary approach in terms of, chief risk officers, data specialists, privacy people, general counsel, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, it reaffirms the importance of all of these people doing these practice exercises so that when the real thing happens, that, they kind of know their roles and they can be mobilized really quickly. And having done a few of these things over the years, I can only say, and these have been over a full day, I can only say there really are a learning exercise and a whole lot of lessons come out of it. Very hard to prepare for the real thing, but as close as you can get, having gone through particularly the roles and responsibilities and some of those triage aspects with you and Avram have touched on, I think there's some amazing lessons to be learned from that.
I totally agree. Like, it goes, when there is a breach or an incident, things move quite quickly. If you haven't practiced that and haven't understood roles and responsibilities, business continuity can go from, X days to potentially a week or weeks, or similarly, if it's, if you hesitate or you don't bring in the right people at the right time, that can have quite severe repercussions downstream.
And Avram, as you touched on, every breach is different, right? I mean, you mentioned, whether it be a medical center or a, school or whatever. I guess, again, as much as you can prepare for these things, that, there's probably not a one size fits all in terms of a response. Yeah.
Yep. So working with these breaches and just touching on what John mentioned, it's But even for forensic people, like it's quite different as well. Like I'm sure approaching a breach for doing digital forensic is a bit different from maybe investigation to like a fraud case or something like that. But I will say that it's really like similar to being a good e-discovery consultant. I think it's very important to have a good relationship with your clients and the digital forensics people working on it. They might be, the digital forensic people might be from a different organization, and I think it's really good to have that communication with them about how the review is going, how your review of the PI is going, what you're finding, and feedback from our lawyers on digital forensics is that it's really important to have a good digital forensic provider that is fast. Breaches usually you want to act fast. You want to contain what's going on. You want to figure out how harmful is the breach, and also very granular. And when we work with digital forensics providers, it's really important to talk to them about what we're seeing, what's going on, what kind of data we're picking up, and letting the digital forensic provider really inform the legal teams about what is really going on, what has happened, because that's all going to go into the reporting to the regulators. As e-discovery professionals, I think it's really important to really be very open-minded to going into a PI review, how you do it. It's very different from a litigation investigation. You're not trying to find the needle in the haystack. You're not trying to find all documents that are responsive to a certain discovery category. It's about finding harmful data, and that how do you search for that? Do you have search terms? You can search Medicare, or search TFN or search passport. That can only do so much. And also and when we think about harmful data, I guess there are two kind of very touchy two very important kind of data that we usually find quite harmful. There's one which is like that kind of like financial information, identity information, credit card information. And then there's the one that's kind of quite sensitive, and one of my colleagues in New Zealand would call it touchy. So that's kind of like, this, maybe someone's sexual orientation, someone's political views, someone's symptoms and medical diagnosis. So some of that information can be quite damaging. It might have like, all right, this is a person, this person has these kind of views, this person was maybe part of a harassment case or something. And so that can be quite harmful as well. So it's really working with your lawyers and reviewing and finding that kind of information. So you have to use a very, well, let me take it back. It's very similar to an EDRM, right? You get the data, you want to cull it and get the review set in a good number of documents to review, because a PI review, the most expensive part, similar to, it's also similar to discovery. The review is the most expensive part. So you want to use a lot of different strategies to really, really cull down the data. You're not really you could use search terms, but it's a bit different. You can use regular expressions, but you need to use a combination of things to really get a good data set to review. Your deduplication strategies can be a bit different too, right? Like when we do litigation stuff, we want to keep families together. We want to produce in full families. However, when it comes to PII, maybe the family's not as important because we're really just looking to pick up on personal identifiable information. You're not producing documents. However, you are producing a list, a notification list. However, you do want to keep the data and the families and the groups all together, because after you notify, if there are affected individuals, say, hey, can you give me all my data? What data was affected for me? You want to be able to report that and be accurate on that. And similar to doing a discovery exercise, you don't want to miss things, right? You don't want to, you don't want to come out with a list and say, all right, these are the ones, and then turns out there's someone else, there's a few other people that were missed, and then we have a different legal case coming up. So it's really important to, again, as e-discovery professional, you want to be a bit open-minded to how you do things, but it's still similar that you want to make things efficient when you do it.
Yep. Thanks, Avram. I want to just change tack a bit now, Rolf, and you and I have many a conversation around the evolution of AI and Gen AI. I understand around 60% of organisations are now using AI and automation to help reduce detection and response times. You touched on some of this earlier, but as I said, I wanted to come back to this because I think it's fascinating. It was mentioned earlier in the conversation about the importance of getting this early understanding to identify, and Avram's just touched on it again, sensitive information that could have been exposed and addressing the challenges associated with reviewing the diverse file types. So again, drilling down into this, how is technology, and particularly with the use of AI and Gen AI, helping to identify breached data, sensitive info, etc.?
I mean, if I look at pre-Gen AI, we have AI, just artificial intelligence, machine patterns and things like that. So if we're looking at just looking for regular expression, using regular expressions to identify patterns of particular numbers and things like that, it's good. It does have some flaws, does miss things, it does over include some things. Also, you know, by adding in then proximity to other words, you can sort of improve the results, but it gets you so far. But with Gen AI now having such a broad knowledge of, you know, the language, it's able to detect that this is what a credit card looks like without you having to say, this is the pattern of credit card I wanted to look for and things like that. So you can easily use the Gen AI large language models to go through and detect each of those pieces of PI, including people's names, entities and things like that. The next step would then be to say, well, this person in proximity to all of these other pieces of PI, they're going to form a relationship. So you can then build that list of that notification list to provide to whoever is going to send out the responses. So I think we're seeing a lot more of this moving to faster, more accurately detecting and being able to respond to those notices.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't
Sorry,
it?
to those regulators.
Yep.
When a breach happens, yeah.
I mean, as a software technologist, as you are, it must be fascinating to have seen this evolved over the past, 2 or 3 years. You mentioned we've gone from AI to now generative AI, and just the difference and how much more advanced we can be in terms of really, trying to identify data a different way that's not going to be as obvious when you're just using, running a AI model over it, etc. So I think, I mean, you must just sit back sometimes and say, wow, where's this going to end, and what's going to be the next generation of, no pun intended, of generative AI?
Yeah, well, it's certainly it's growing all the time. Every day there's something new, whether it's doing the detection of PI, identifying relationships between people, communications, and that type of interaction that people have, being able to identify potential threat actors. You know, I can see this person, if you're doing it as a, you mentioned one of the questions earlier was about what a software developer is building. If we're looking at perhaps monitoring what individuals are doing, if you're being able to use Gen AI to say, here's a pattern that somebody's doing something that may lead them open to being, clicking on that link, because they're doing stuff on their work laptop. I just think that that's going to come leaps and bounds in the future. And that's on top of identifying individuals and saying, hey, this type of person, this is perhaps, an email address that is their organization because the domain is an organization one, or this is their residential address because of the location it's not in a work location area. It's not in the city. It's not in a factory complex. It's actually in a residential area. So that's likely to be a home address. Yeah, we don't have that now, but we probably do, but I don't know about it. But, that type of detection would be super handy to identify without saying home address, blah, and, residential address or work address. And okay, we can exclude the work address because we know that's the work premises. So it's not really PI.
Yep.
But yeah, I think it is fascinating.
It is. We're just about to start get into the last question I'm going to throw at our panelists. So we still have, it's just gone 15 minutes before the hour, so we've still got that time to go. So if anybody does want to put anything into the chat to ask any of our panelists a question or make a comment, we will have some time to do that. So my last question for each of you to share with our audience is maybe what do you see as your top 2 or 3 key takeaways? I mean, these could be tips, these could be lessons learned, these could be things to prioritize and do in the event of a breach, things to be wary of. So no doubt you've covered that, but I guess in terms of your elevator speech or conversation, what might be the 2 or 3 key takeaways that you'd like to leave with our audience today? So Avram, maybe you want to kick off with this?
Yeah, I would say the one to keep an open mind. Keep an open mind because I think cyber changes quite quickly. A bit different from e-discovery. I mean, the way we've been doing e-discovery and the things we look for and everything, it's been relatively the same for a while, except maybe recently with a lot of the LLM, Gen AI kind of stuff. However, with cyber, it changes quite a bit over the years. The way threat actors are breaching are changing all the time. I do want to bring up about tech vendors as well too. So if you're working on a breach and you have a specific kind of software, do give good feedback to them. It's really important to give them feedback on where they need to improve. Like I think it must be kind of tough for Rolf because things are changing all the time. Picking up a name in TFN or Medicare number and password is not good enough. Maybe not good enough anymore. We have to step into classifying images, classifying audios, classifying videos, being able to detect those, or what are the high-risk images, low-risk images, images of people, images of signatures. So give good feedback to your tech vendors. I think be very open-minded. Know your role too. I think that's very important as well. We are e-discovery people. We are good at what we do. We are tech savvy, but do realize that people that do digital forensics, like they're good at what they do too, and let them give their reporting on what actually happened and try not to influence too much on that. Like everyone has a very, very specific role in this one. And it's pretty important not to overstep and use, prior, how we've used to do things to apply it to breaches. Yeah.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Avram. John, it's your words of wisdom. Leave with the audience.
I'll go for 3. So the first one, which I harped on about at the beginning, sorry everyone, readiness. So make sure you have a plan in place, you're practicing it. When something does go wrong, again, you know how to mobilize and who's doing what. Second one would be around education. So promoting that, the cyber safe culture. There has to be that cultural shift where it's everyone's responsibility and, little things like, again, going back to inside a threat, it's not always a malicious action. So having that culture in place and the education in place, you're able to spot, excuse me, you're able to spot something like to use a suspicious email as an example, faster than having to accidentally click on it and then hell breaks loose. And the third one, we didn't really touch on it on the call, but given we're all technologists, there's simple fixes out there. So for those people who do work as an IT functional within IT, multi-factor authentication, making sure patches are up to date, just implementing those simple fixes. And similarly with one we saw recently, don't save your passwords on a text file on your desktop, use password banks if you have to, there's, to name drop them, things like LastPass, just make sure what you're doing, even your barriers are also secure.
Yeah. Great advice. Great advice, John. Yeah. I think there's still a lot of people saving, passwords and reusing, one password for everything and all those kind of things. So
password style one should be banned.
Rolf?
Too. Yeah, I agree with that. Certainly, making sure your passwords are safe. I guess having where possible, your data segregated, so that if something does happen, that the blast radius, as Abram mentioned, is not as great because, it's got a different, might be on a separate subnet, may not get infiltrated. I've seen definitely that happen in organizations where one part of it was breached, but, their main day-to-day business was separated from their core internal business BAU platform. So having that separation sort of saved them a little bit. Certainly the use of AI, again, I'm going to harp on about that a little too much. But I think with the Gen AI increasing the threat, we have to use it to actually be able to respond and detect those threats. So I see that being a big, combating evil with evil, essentially. If we call Gen AI evil, but yeah, I see that happening a lot more because again, it's not like almost gone are the days of doing pattern matching to find was this credit card number detected. It'll just say, here's a list of things I want to detect. It knows what to look for and it'll go off and detect them without you having to reinvent the wheel each time.
Yep. Great. Thanks, gents. They were all very different, but very valuable and interesting perspectives. So thank you all for sharing that. We've actually got some questions that have come in from the audience. So perhaps I might just read a couple of these out while we've still got not 9 minutes or so. So there's a comment here. Thanks, Avram, for that. We deal with this all the time, and it's only getting harder with each incident and the associated sensitive data assessment. One thing we are seeing a bit more of lately is actually a slightly elevated awareness of non-PII sensitive data, e.g. the commercially sensitive data that clients are very interested in. That's probably more a comment than a question, but obviously what you've said is resonated. Do you want to make any further comment on that?
No comment. I agree. I agree with David. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just find the other questions that have come in. Okay, some good questions here. As an e-discovery professional reviewing data breaches and aiming to stay current but not part of the IT team, what practical steps can I take to supporting IT in managing and responding to these incidents? Anyone in particular want to have a crack at that one?
I had to go through this not that long ago. So whoever's asked that question, I think the first bit of advice I would provide is let them know what you can actually do, especially if you have e-discovery tools in-house. The IT doesn't necessarily know what value you might be able to add. They might be focused on the containment or the cyber forensic part and not realize that, hey, our PI has been breached. We've actually got a solution for this. So in terms of, I wouldn't say stay current, but just, let them know what you can do. Hopefully you've got enough influence that you can be part of that planning process. So when there are those reviews and those tabletop exercises, they're considering whoever asked that question as well.
Yep. Thanks, John.
All right.
Another one here. Can you share examples of why clients decide that a notification report is required in a breach? I've been involved in some breaches whereby the client has decided not to run this process.
That might be a me question. I'll just reread the question, make sure I get this right. With clients, a lot of clients don't want to share too much because they feel it's going to hurt their reputation in the market or in public. Going out there and saying, we got hit, these are the X number of individuals, that's why, I guess it's a PR thing. They don't really want to go out there telling everyone that, hey, your data is affected, your data is affected, your data is affected, we got affected. They're afraid that it might impact their business. So I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons. But also it's very important that that client should work with their their lawyers and figure out, you have to work with the regulators too, because the regulators do have a requirement. You have an obligation to your clients. The client has an obligation to their clients and their customers, and there's an obligation to the regulators as well. So I'm not a lawyer, but it's really best to work with the lawyer looking at the situation, and the lawyer will give good advice based on a lot of factors, based on how good the digital forensic provider is, based on what the IR comes back with, based on what they know about the data that was impacted and the way the business works. So there's no real formula, but it's a combination of things. Yeah.
Yep.
Hope that answered it. Yeah.
Thanks, Avram. Two more questions here. Next one is, what role do you think information governance has in improving outcomes with data breach? I might just open the batting on that one and lend in my own observations and views here. One of the previous hats I wore was as a chief data officer. So this whole notion around governance is central to that. So having well-governed data in terms of where it's located, who has access to it, around privileges, and importantly, disposing of data when it's actually no longer needed. Now, we know that within particular cases, etc., and other sensitive data, there is requirements that it needs to be retained for a period of time, but I think there's lots of organisations out there collecting data that they really don't need or really don't use. And I saw a quote recently, it opens up this honeypot for people to have something else to aim for, to infiltrate, and obviously the risk and the damage that can go with that could have been minimised had organisations had better practices in place around what they held, how they looked after it, how they governed it, how they protected it, and how they got rid of it when they no longer needed it. Does anyone else want to add anything to that one?
It's a great summary, John.
No? Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say that was good. The only thing is it helps, identify. It's that education piece and preparation that John Kay was talking about before, being able to have a plan of action when something does happen. I think it's vital.
Yep.
Just want to add to that one as well too. I think there's one part of cyber that we didn't talk much about, and the role is people that do pen testing, penetration testing. So there are people in the cyberspace that do things that try to test out your systems, try to hack and get in. So I think it's good to think about engaging some of those kind of individuals and organizations to really see and really stress test your security system to see how good it is.
Great point. Yeah, really good point. We're just at a minute before the hour. We have got one more question here, but maybe let's have a go, Rolf. I think this one is for you.
Yeah.
How far away do you think we are from being able to take a data set that's been leaked by a TA and point a Gen AI engine at the data set and ask plain language questions such as, how many individuals are associated with XYZ PII data points? Probably not a quick answer, but anyway. Probably
closer than I think. Someone's out there probably developing it now. I guess there's a few steps before all of that, and John's covered them off before, and so has Avram, about that identifying what has been and then identifying what it is that you want to look for before you then ask a Gen AI engine. You would have to get the data in a form that you can read, essentially. And if we're looking at images and AV files as well, that perhaps have some information on it, may complicate that. I mean, really, is it impossible? I don't think so. I think if somebody's written some rules around what it is to ask a Gen AI, that you fill in the parameters of sort of what you want it to look for, Is it in the realms of impossibility? No, I don't think so. Certainly what we're doing at Relativity is enhancing our application for data breach to improve the detection of PI. Again, it still needs people to look through it and say, this PI belongs to this individual. That's going to get better as time goes on, as the models change and become available. So yeah, to be able to say, here's my data, detect all the PI and the individuals, I don't think it's that far away.
Yep. All right. Exciting times ahead.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's a nice way to round it off, Rolf. Thank you for that. And well done to each of you on taking those questions from the audience. And thank you to our audience for shooting those through. It always makes it a bit more interesting when we've got some questions from all of you that you can make the most of putting to our panelists that we're fortunate to have. So look, I'll just close it off. It's just gone 1 minute past the hour, so great timing. Thank you, John. Thank you, Avram. Thank you, Rolf, for all your work in both the lead up and for being available today. It was really great to hear all your views. And again, thanks to Relativity and also to ACED's Australia New Zealand chapter for putting this on. As I said earlier, lots of opportunities if you wanted to get involved with ACEDS, and also having a look at the Legal Data Intelligence website as well, and of course Relativity, who are also sponsoring this today, as well as one of the sponsors for ACEDS. So we'll leave it there. Thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day until next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.